Hello all, today we're going to talk about perceived responsiveness in text messaging, the role of emoji use, by Coyle and Carmichael. It was published in the October 2019 issue of Computers and Human Behavior. If you'd like to read the article for yourself, check the description down below for a citation and link. Insert requisite comment about how engagement drives channel growth, and that if you, the viewer, want my content to be viewed more favorably by the all-powerful algorithm, liking and sharing the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel all appease the gnomes that do the thing. I think it goes without saying that smartphones have become a large part of our lives, and with this rise of smartphone use, we have also seen a meteoric rise in computer-mediated communication. Computer-mediated communication, CMC, is exactly what it sounds like. It's communicating with others through a computer. This can include texting, email, and instant messaging. However, using CMC comes with an important cost. We lose our ability to communicate through nonverbal behavior. In face-to-face communication, we use things like tone of voice and body movements to help get across our intended meaning. Yet despite these challenges, people still extensively use CMC to build intimacy and foster relationships. And to attempt to overcome this lack of nonverbal behavior, people have turned to emoticons and their evolution, emojis. For the two of you out there who aren't familiar with emojis, they are cute little pictures that people use to communicate all sorts of things from happiness to sexual interest to disgust and beyond. The interpersonal process model of intimacy posits that intimacy develops when two people self-disclose personal information and receive affirmation and understanding for doing so. This warm discourse, then, contributes to positive perceptions of the other individual, feelings of acceptance, and the belief that the other individual evaluates the self positively. Responsiveness, then, can be defined as the listener end of this process of building intimacy, and in face-to-face communication, nonverbal cues are an essential part of this. We nod, smile, and make eye contact to assure the other person that we are in fact listening, and we understand what they're talking about. And yet people still manage to communicate responsiveness through CMC without these tools. One interesting finding is that people often give the person with whom they are communicating the benefit of the doubt regarding intimacy and self-disclosure. People also tend to overestimate the degree of similarity they have with their communication partners. Furthermore, the anonymity granted by CMC might help strangers form social bonds, since anonymity allows greater privacy in which to self-disclose. So, given that people do tend to flock to CMC, there's a need for a way to make up for all the nonverbal communication that facilitates face-to-face communication. Enter emojis and emoticons. Numerous studies have found that the use of emojis can clarify intent, as well as make positive messages more positive and negative messages less negative. And unlike emoticons, emojis have grown to include all sorts of emotional expressions. In theory, they possess the ability to facilitate the communication of any kind of emotional intent the sender desires, and thus might help foster a feeling of responsiveness. Which brings us to the present study. The authors recruited a final sample of 179 participants who are college students at what I assume is Brooklyn College. Undergraduate samples are fairly common in psychology research since they're readily available, easy to recruit, and often free. That said, undergraduate samples tend to be wider and richer than the general populace, which leads to a whole host of generalizability concerns. That said, their sample was fairly ethnically diverse, but since the authors did not report any socioeconomic data, I cannot speak to how representative their sample was in that regard. As to procedure, participants were told that they would be engaging in an instant messaging exercise with another participant. They were brought into the lab and went through the consent procedure, including an instruction to not disclose any personally identifiable information to their partner. First, they were instructed to write down 3 recent positive events and 3 recent negative events. They then gave ratings for each event. Then, they were told that they would be randomized as either the discloser or the receiver in the following interaction. Once they found out that they were the discloser, they would disclose their second or third most positive or negative event to the other participant using iMessage on a lab-provided iPod Touch. After a short interaction, the participant would then disclose their second or third most negative or positive event. In order to control for order effects, participants were randomized to disclose the positive or negative event first, and whether they would disclose their second or third most valenced event was counterbalanced. It should come as no great shock that the other participant was in fact a Confederate who was always the receiver and gave pre-scripted responses based on prior research. For half the participants, the Confederate used some emojis in their messages, and for the other half, the Confederate included no emojis. Responders used only one emoji at a time. Each interaction lasted between 5 and 10 minutes. On average, responders sent between 8 and 9 messages, and disclosers sent about 11 messages. In the emoji condition, responders averaged between 4 and 5 emojis in both the positive and negative event conditions. After each interaction, participants rated the responsiveness of their partner using a modified version of the perceived responsiveness scale, which consisted of 7 items rated on a 7-point interval scale from 1, not at all true, to 7, extremely true. Their impressions of their partner using a set of 20 adjectives from the interpersonal quality scale, how they felt their partner thought about them by responding to 7 statements on a 7-point Likert scale. On this last one, I will make my usual point that it is generally not good to create your own measures since we don't know if they meet our admittedly high validity standards. That said, if there isn't an existing measure that does what you want, sometimes you have to make do with an ad hoc one. Participants also reported what percentage of their text and social media posts contain emojis, as well as the percentage of people to whom they send emojis. These values were then averaged into a composite emoji use score. I personally would have averaged the social media post percentage and the product of the messages percentage and the people percentage, since that would give us a more direct measure of how often they use emojis, but that's a nitpick. Additionally, participants reported the various reasons for which they use emojis. And now results. To examine whether emoji use caused changes in perceived responsiveness, the authors conducted a 2x2 ANOVA and found no significant effects. They also did not find any significant effects for their other outcomes of interest. All graphs going forward are my own creations based on data in the paper and through communication with the first author. Error bars represent the 95% confidence interval of the means. At this point, I assume the authors were thoroughly disappointed. They then thought to do some exploratory analyses and see if maybe the participants' own emoji use might change these results. Now, I have absolutely no problem with them doing this. I am a huge fan of let's see what happens science. However, by my count, the authors ran at least 31 tests. That poses a serious family-wise error problem. If we go back to the original source for a p is less than 0.05 cutoff for significance, that bar was proposed as a reasonable standard for a single test. However, when you run a lot of tests, your so-called family-wise error rate goes up exponentially. If we want to get mathy on this, the chance that none of your results are due to what is called type 1 error is 0.95 raised to the power of t, where t is the number of tests you run. In this study, the researchers ran, by my count, at least 31 tests, so there's only a 20% chance that none of the results I'm about to report are false positives. This likelihood is concerningly low, even for exploratory analyses. Now, to be fair to the authors, doing things like Bonferroni corrections to keep the family-wise error rate under control are not yet standard operating procedure. I genuinely do not know how many peer reviewers are demanding that manuscript authors account for their family-wise error rates. That said, especially in light of the replication crisis, I think we need to demand more of ourselves and of our journals. With those caveats in mind, let's get into the exploratory analyses. First, the authors conducted a series of chi-squared tests to determine if participant emoji use depended on whether the confederate used emojis or not. They found that in both the positive and negative conditions, confederate emoji use corresponded to greater participant emoji use. In the emoji condition, the responder was usually the first to use emojis, and the participant's next message often included an emoji. They then conducted a series of 2x2 ANOVAs to examine if emoji use convergence predicted differences in how the participants felt about their partners. The authors did not conduct 3-way ANOVAs since they found that participants were not always consistent in their emoji use across the positive and negative disclosure conditions. For responsiveness during positive disclosures, there were no significant main effects, but there was a significant interaction. When the responder used emojis, participants who also used emojis rated the responder as more responsive than participants who did not. When the responder did not use emojis, there was no significant difference between responsiveness ratings from emoji users and non-emoji users. For responsiveness during negative disclosures, there were no significant effects. When looking at positive impressions during positive disclosures, we see a similar pattern to the responsiveness results. When the responder used emojis, the participants who also used emojis had a more favorable impression of the responder than those who did not use emojis. There were once again no significant effects in the negative disclosure results. And, for reflected appraisal, the aforementioned pattern held. When the responder used emojis, emoji users felt that the responder had a more favorable view of them than non-emoji users. And there was no significant difference between emoji users and non-emoji users when the responder did not use emojis. Again, no significant effects during negative event disclosures. So in sum, I think we can say that emoji users might respond well to other emoji users, at least when the subjects of discussion are positively valenced. However, my earlier point about the family-wise error rate looms large. The fact that the authors showed a consistent pattern of positive results does ameliorate that concern somewhat, but I really need to see a replication before I feel comfortable making any kind of definitive statements about how emoji use might impact receiver impressions of the sender. So, looking to the future, I really want to see a replication of these findings. If a replication attempt succeeds, then we can maybe look to underlying mechanisms. Why is it that only emoji users view responders differently when emojis are used or not used? Could it be that emoji use is a signifier of similarity? Well, that's all for now. If you have a paper you'd like me to do a video on, or more thoughts on this one, let me know in the comments.